This week we're looking at number 3 in our series entitled The Promise, God's Everlasting Covenant. This one's entitled All Future Generations, and that's a phrase that crops up significantly in God's description of the agreement, the covenant that he has with people. This is his promise. It's not just a one-off, it's for all future generations. That's his promise. And we see it there in the rainbow covenant. I really stumble over the word because it's really his promise that he's not going to do this. It's not a contract. It's not something that you sign. It's his promise with you, his agreement that this is the way things are going to be. And that's a God that I can truly love because he's really trying to help us in our situation in this damaged world where there's ice and snow and not just weather conditions, but all the results of sin, of corruption and evil, and people doing criminal things, and even those who claim to be good are not really good at all, not in God's sight. We have to recognize that. We're given material mainly in Genesis and in Isaiah and Revelation. So pick up your Bibles and look at that and see what God is saying for all future generations, not just this initial promise, but this is something that is there for everybody, and it's going to be something which is consistent because God is always speaking consistently. Love that quote from Franz Delitzsch. Coming from the sun, shining through the dark clouds, the rainbow symbolized the heavenly pervading the earthly, and as it spans the horizon, it reminds man that God's covenant is universal, as was the flood that will never recur. A wonderful description of this eternal, everlasting covenant agreement that God makes with human beings. And it's not that we're demanding it, but that God gives it to us. Why do we want to have this kind of covenant in the first place? Covenants are written out, they're given because people don't trust. When you take out a covenant on a house, when you do your mortgage agreement, that's a legal covenant, and it's full of lots of legal language that says that this is what is agreed, and if you don't, then there's going to be some problems. And I think that's the real issue. We don't trust each other, which is why we want it all written down. And we really don't trust God either. And God says, I know you don't really trust me, so I'm going to give you these promises, and it's going to be just like a cast iron guarantee because I want you to trust me even though you don't. So I'm going to give you this as an eternal agreement that I'm never going to break because I recognize that you need these kinds of things. Why do we make promises? Why do we say these things to people? Why do we even break our promises? Because we're not trustworthy people. That's the tragedy. But God is trustworthy. You can always trust in him. And so as we look through, you can see in the biblical material, Genesis 3 talks about Eve eating the fruit and giving it to Adam. Genesis 6 talks about the world before the flood, which as God looked down, he saw it was only evil continually. That's the tragedy. We are wicked, evil people who can't be trusted. And so that's why we can't really trust in God, because we don't see him in the way that we should. So he makes that agreement where with Noah in Genesis 6, the rainbow covenant, that he would never do that again. Genesis 9 and Isaiah 4 says that there will be a remnant that is left in Jerusalem that will be holy. This is the promise for the future. And then in Revelation 12 we have the people of God who keep God's commandments have the faith of Jesus. I'm praying this week that as you look again at these promises that God gave for all generations, all future generations, forever, he promises to be a trustworthy God, that you'll trust in him and see him for who he truly is, one that you can always totally depend upon.